Good afternoon. Welcome to the Public Services Committee meeting. The meeting will start in 60 seconds.
Permit today. Isn't it Michelle? Michelle, my other member? Oh, fine. I know. I'd like to call this meeting of the Public Services Committee, Tuesday, July 9th, 2013, to order. First item on the agenda would be a review and approval of minutes dated June 11th, 2013.
Move approval, Aguilar.
Second, Erkenbach.
Okay, we have a move and a second. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All right. Next on the agenda, we will have a presentation from Dean Lanier on our sprinkler task force update.
Afternoon, Dean Lanier, Fire Marshal, Sioux Falls Fire Rescue. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to Kenny Anderson, Councilor Anderson, for taking the task force and putting together a team that really had the opportunity and both the time to analyze fire sprinklers and provide some feedback and recommendation to this committee. We did have several meetings, quite a large opportunity to talk and discuss through the issue with developers, technical representatives from the fire industry, both Ron Bell and myself. But I think at the end, the process itself lended itself to a better answer for you. While the end outcome kind of came in a little bit different manner, I think the process itself was beneficial for all the different people involved to learn about what is involved with fire sprinklers and why sprinklers. I've just got a few slides to present to you, and then I'll try to answer any questions that you might have. A lot of the discussion that we've had about fire sprinklers has been, separate and distinct from why are we doing this in the first place? What is it so fantastic about sprinklers that they're needed regardless of what building that they're put into? Sioux Falls is going through quite a huge transition. We see construction at almost every corner of the city. A lot of the buildings are very large in scope. We have a project just down the street on Dakota, large apartment buildings being built on Main Street. And each of these different buildings have sprinklers inside of them, but very robust systems. They would not be defined as small systems. They're servicing multi-level buildings that are up to 5 and 6 stories tall. So those buildings don't necessarily are a good example of the kind of buildings that we're talking about with these smaller apartment buildings. And I think much of the discussion that we had during the many meetings that we had with this task force kind of brought down that concept of scope with large systems of sprinklers. and scoped it down to a point that we really are talking about smaller residential structures. We're not talking about a 6-story hotel or a 3-story apartment building with 80-plus units in it. We are talking small, 1- and 2-story apartment buildings up to 16 units, and that's the threshold at which we stop. With that in mind, probably the best thing for me to do is define why we need sprinklers inside these structures. And much of that is involved with some of the things that have been changed over the years. I found this video as a good representation of how things have changed in our homes. If you're like me, I remember as a kindergarten, first grader, I used to go to my grandmother's house after school and jump up on her couch and stand on her couch. I wasn't a very good kid at that age, doing bad things. But much of the activity at her house was, in her living room, hanging out in her living room. Back then, watching a little bit of cartoons in the afternoon. But what I came to understand as I studied the fire science involved with fires and fire activity then versus now, we really do have a good foundation of understanding maybe there's some changes that have occurred. Maybe there's a difference between grandma's couch and the couch that you and I go and buy at a local store now. And this video from Underwriters Laboratories provides a good context for why there's such a difference. On the left-hand side, you'll see the legacy room. It's filled with furniture that's in excess of 20 years old. On the right, you see modern furniture, things that you could go and buy off the shelf today. Now, what has happened over these years, we've kind of progressed from things that we furnished homes with into more lightweight materials. 30 years ago in Grandma's house, she had cotton linen sofa. It was stuffed with feathers and principally made of hardened wood. So it's kind of an expectation that maybe those materials react a little bit differently than what you and I can go and buy out of the local Lewis or the local Home Depot. What we buy today does have fire resistivities. It's very clear, it does. It has some it has been treated with chemicals, it has been tested, and it does have fire resistivities. However, to say it behaves the same as what Grandma had in her house may not be a good comparison. As the video continues to roll, the explanation of what's happening is probably important as well. Firefighters understand when we enter a room and it's on fire, there's more things going on than just the fire that you see in front of you. There's a lot of different things going on. The black smoke that you see at the top of the room is actually heat and gas being trapped at the ceiling. Now, what that means is it's kind of hard to think of this in 3 dimensions, but I'll show you this a little bit later in another video. What's actually happening is not only is the fire spreading from direct contact and radiation to the items around it, but actually on the ceiling space, there's heat being transmitted down towards the floor. And it's actually raising the temperature inside the room, far more than the example that you see on the left. Now we have in our minds, Chief Sedaris always talks about we have great response times, and we do. We are very fortunate that we can get to almost every emergency at a threshold that meets our accreditation and really fosters a good environment in which we can do enough to save people in the amount of time that we have. But what we also have to recognize is there's been some changes in what we furnish our homes with. So now when we talk about a fire growth and how far it can go in 2 to 3 minutes, the circumstances that we see in that modern room in comparison to that legacy room starts to be far more dramatic, and it tends to lend itself to why sprinklers are necessary. Now, I can tell you in that modern room, at this point, it reaches a stage at which it's no longer tenable by the folks that are in that space. Now, when I talk to fifth graders about fire safety, I explain it to them this way. If I could put you in a fire suit and stand you right in front of that fire, you would actually feel an air current blowing across your pants. What's going on inside your home when you have a fire reaching that stage is actually sucking oxygen into that room. So now suddenly in a room that may have been tenable before, now inside that same tenant unit, the space is no longer a space in which somebody can live and continue to breathe. Now, the video roll continues to go forward, and it goes on and on and on. It really does a good job of kind of showing you why things are so different now. We have different materials inside our homes. We furnished our homes in different ways, and the products inside behave differently. So, yes, 15, 20 years ago, could we respond to a fire and put that fire out after 28 minutes? Certainly. And even after 15, 20 minutes, could someone survive in that environment? Most certainly. But the reality of the matter is now we have about 3 to 4 minutes, and if the tenants are not out of that space in that time, they do not survive. So we reflect back on, well, why are sprinklers necessary? The second part of this equation is just not this flashover idea, but it's also understanding what kind of temperatures are we talking about, because there's a stark and dramatic difference when we use fire sprinklers versus when we don't. This video was put together as a means to kind of try to explain what's going on in a room while it's on fire. You'll notice that temperature at the bottom, at the floor. The thing I want to make sure that you understand is that smoke alarms are an absolute necessity inside every home, and they do a great job of getting us warning. However, what we've seen in the fire service is a shrinking of the time that has elapsed from the time when the fire is first noticed versus the time in which the fire reaches flashover. And the shrinking of that timeline has led to more and more devastating consequences associated with fire behavior in our city. No one's going to survive 184 degrees at the floor, and that's after 2 minutes. Contrast that with this second video. This room is protected by sprinklers. And you'll notice as the time elapses, there's really no difference in fire growth up until the time at which the sprinkler head goes off inside the room. The temperature at the bottom is also a very important thing to understand, because while it stops at 82 degrees, the contrast that versus the other example was 184 degrees. Today's ambient temperature outside is 83. Survivable even if you are in the room of origin, and the fire doesn't grow to a point at which it starts extending into the structure and getting into areas in which it can run vertically and laterally into the structural part of the building. And that's the reason why many have started moving towards fire sprinklers as an answer to that dynamic that I just described. It is technical, and fortunately all the meetings that we had gave us an opportunity to explain all those technical aspects. It is important that people understand that. But in final analysis, what's really important that you understand is that we are giving people the opportunity to survive an event. And in many cases, it will be their only opportunity to survive that fire event inside an apartment. So with that, I'll try to answer any questions that you have.
Questions from the committee? Mr. Karski?
Mr. Lanier, the heat obviously kills, but at what point does the toxic fumes, that type of thing, when does that become a factor in some of those videos?
It's really about elevation. When you have smoke entrainment inside a room, it starts filling from the highest point down. In most cases, when we train well and when we talk to residents about what to do when they hear a smoke alarm, as long as the residents don't stand up first and inhale quite a bit of smoke, we've had really good successes. The interesting thing is we had a fire last year in a 6-story apartment building downtown. The gentleman that had left some cooking on the stove, which is not uncommon, the #1 cause of fires in our city. While the smoke did fill his room, the lack of fire growth prevented the smoke level from continuing to bank down and further closer to the floor. He wasn't exactly able to get himself out of the room, but just being on the floor, there was enough breathable air for close to 10, 15 minutes for us to be able to get to him and get him out of that room.
If I could, it's really taken aback, I guess, by the difference between the legacy room and you would think that over time that we would have made, the fire retardant materials and this type of thing that you hear so much about it that that wouldn't happen that way. It would be just the opposite effect. I guess a statement to that just really surprised me to see that.
It is, and honestly, it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to explain all these different things that are going on. I've studied the science behind it as to why these products are reacting differently. We've kind of changed in what we accept as furniture and furnishings for our home. What we buy now, it likely is not covered with a natural covering like cloth or linen. Most of what you're going to find in a store nowadays is going to have some kind of nylon covering on it. It has been treated to withstand heat for a period of time, so it does have some ratings to it. The problem is as it reaches a temperature at which it can't exactly hold its form anymore, the tendency for it chemically is to break down. And once that occurs, then the amount of heat it's able to give off will be far greater than if a piece of furniture was stuffed with feathers.
Councilor Offenbach?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, want to express my appreciation for this group. I mean, that's one of the things that's really important about, to me, at least as a council member, is to bring those kinds of experts together and let you guys kind of hash it out. Let's talk about it from the perspective that you have from fire science. Let's not talk about it from my emotional perspective of watching this film. I'm ready to vote for anything watching that, but you've gone through that, and I really appreciate all the folks that were involved with that. I really do. My question then is for the chairs that we have an ordinance with changes to it. Are we going to have Dean walk us through this afternoon, or what's our plan?
I was going to ask Dean to give us a brief overview of the fire ordinance that is going to be coming up to this committee and the council, and then also discuss the reasons why we've got out of compliance. Yes.
Great, thank you. And again, thank you very much, Dean.
If you'd like to have a discussion on it, the fire code and the building code are exact duplicate language. So Ron Bell is here to explain anything you'd like as far as the ordinance revisions and the language changes.
Sure. If we could have Mr. Bell come up.
Good afternoon, Ron Bell with Building Services. Yeah, what you have in front of you is Section 1 and 2 that deals with amendments to the fire code and the building code that deals with the sprinkler ordinance. And I'm taking the opportunity to also put in a couple cleanup ordinances that we need with building services. But if we can start out with the sprinkler system, sprinkler requirements, I believe it was either the second or the third meeting of our sprinkler task force that I got a call from the building official in Yankton who was adopting their codes and asked me if I knew whether the state fire marshal had made changes when they adopted their 2009 fire code and building code. I had no idea. What happened was that Paul Merriman, who's the state fire marshal, when they adopted the 2009 building code and fire code, they went through their process and had public hearings with legislators and so forth to adopt it, but they were trying to get caught up with the codes because at that point they hadn't adopted sprinklers in hotels and motels. So they finally got that in place because the state does regulate hotels and motels explicitly, but they also chose to modify the sprinkler requirement in the building code and the fire code, which at that time was all apartments, which is 3 units or more, are required to be sprinklered. When they adopted that code, they put in a requirement to say that residents having a fire area of 6 or more. Dean and I had conversations with Paul just last week and had a good conversation. Paul did get that information out to the fire service people in the South Dakota Municipal League, but the South Dakota Municipal League did not get that out to the building officials across the state of South Dakota. It didn't affect Rapid City or Spearfish or Pierre, who have adopted the code in place, which they're requiring sprinkling of all their apartments, but it did affect it. And it does affect Aberdeen, Watertown, Mitchell, Sioux Falls, and Yankton, who are in the process of adopting their codes. So once we found out that there was a state law that was out there, we cannot be less stringent, that we chose to go with what is in place at the state fire marshal's office. So when we did find this out, probably about 2 or 3 months ago, we've had apartment developers come in that we have required them to sprinkle at 6 or more units because we couldn't do anything less than what's in the state code by the fire marshal's office. So before I go to the other cleanup ordinances, I'd like to ask or answer any questions that you may have.
Councilor from Buckle.
Thank you, Ron. I think then that covers under Section 1 and Section 2 in the handout that we have, 903.2.8 for Group R, Section 1 and Section 2. That's the 6 or more dwelling units,
Right.
correct? Okay.
I may elaborate on that for 1 second because the fire marshal's office did get it right where they said fire area of 6 or more, which does mean that depending on the configuration of the floor plan for the building, that you could build 6 units and put up a 2-hour fire barrier and go with another 6 units, another 2-hour fire barrier. The code does allow that. The code allows the sprinkler thresholds based on fire area criteria. So just keep in mind that there is the possibility that there could be buildings that are built with fire barriers at 6 or more units and not be sprinklered. I got to tell you that a very long process of the sprinkler task force was dealing with the affordability issue, and it really went into the sprinkler trade-off criteria that's out there, that has always been out there for the developers. So just keep in mind that this is consistent with building codes, and there is a distinct possibility that developers, contractors can still build their buildings without sprinklers if they choose to, with appropriate fire resistivities.
Councilor Aguilar.
So Ron, once this is passed and in effect, what happens to those units that have already been built and whatever? How long of a time do they have to get up to code?
We're choosing not to go retroactively on those building permits that have already had a certificate of occupancy. We're not going back to existing buildings to have them be brought up to code. Again, this was adopted by the State Fire Marshal's Office in June of 2011, so we've had practically 2 years of apartment construction that's out there that by state law should have been sprinklered, but we were not aware of it. So no, we are not choosing to go back retroactively for those buildings that were built.
Does that have to be stated in the ordinance itself? Because it seems like it's blanket here.
Yeah, this is dealing with new construction.
Oh, just new construction, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Also, if I can state something on that too, we're hoping that the trade-offs that are going to be presented here during this meeting. We'll also encourage maybe some of the existing owners to sprinkle their buildings. So these trade-offs are going to be something that would give them a significant cost savings in sprinkling their buildings, and then there's the insurance savings also. So, you know, those are some of the things that we discussed in those meetings as, you know, we struggled with if we were going to try to grandfather in some of those newer built buildings. Okay, thank you.
Okay. If I can go with the rest of the cleanup ordinance, Section 3 and Section 4 is dealing with the boards that's administered with the by building services, and Section 1 deals with the electrical board. Section 3 deals with the electrical board. Section 4 deals with the plumbing board. We've had existing ordinances that really define the specific type of member that is required for those boards, and quite frankly, we're having a very hard time filling those positions. For instance, the electrical board previously required one licensed electrical contractor, one representative of a light and power company, one representative of a licensed journeyman, one local representative of a state-approved electrical engineer. It's very, very hard to get people to volunteer for these boards with those type of credentials. So what we propose to do with the electrical board and the plumbing board is just simply go back to what we have for our other boards and insert the language that the members that are qualified by experience and training to be able to pass on matters pertaining to the electrical systems and the plumbing system. So that's really just a cleanup with those two. And the last one is during recodification. I don't know how this happened, but all the licenses that building services administered was given to the economic development coordinator. So we're eliminating that and bringing it back to the chief building official, which is building services. So that's just really a cleanup.
Mr. Karski.
This doesn't address how many people serve on the boards, does it?
All of our boards are 5 members.
Okay, it's not specifically addressed in here, and I think that would probably be a good idea.
Councilor from Bach.
We're probably just looking at segments. If you know, if you were to take it in context, wouldn't it have the numbers in context?
I'm almost surprised that it doesn't, but all of our boards are made up of 5 members with a quorum of 3 by the rules of the board. But if you'd like it inserted, we can certainly do that.
I'd feel more comfortable knowing that we specify knowing how many people are on these boards, just for administrative reasons.
And we might get you a better copy because the Section 3 looks like what we underscored is overstruck, so we can work on that.
Any other questions? Councilor from
If I might, maybe we want to see it when it comes to full council. Maybe we want to see it in context. It may, you know, again, we're looking at just a piece of it. Certainly you can insert the word, you know, 5 members, but I just want to make sure we're not overwriting what's, you know, already clear somewhere else. I often struggle with that out of context stuff. You have to make sure you're looking at it with the rest of the ordinance.
Yeah, in the codes, there's 2 criteria. That is this provision right here that makes up what the duties of the board is. Then the second criteria is that the board cannot simply make variances to the code. So there's only 2 sections that we can take a look at.
Okay, thank you.
Anything further, Ron? That's good. All right, thank you. Any other questions from the committee? I'd like to have Captain Lanier come up again. Yes, as we were having this committee also, another smaller issue came up, and I asked Mr. Lanier to speak to this, and this is private fire hydrants within our city. After having a brief discussion with him, I thought it was something that should be brought to the attention of the council. If you would, please.
The fire code is is actually trying to provide incentives for sprinklers being applied to residential occupancies. And there's a couple of different ways in which it's trying to deal with the cost offsets and that kind of thing. In discussion with Councilor Anderson, we did bring to the task force the understanding that fire code has greater allowances when sprinklers are used in residential occupancies, and it allows you to do some things that would not normally be allowed within the fire code. One of such things is the narrowing of streets and actual elimination of some fire hydrants as a result. There's language in the code that gives the fire marshal of a jurisdiction enough latitude to look at the distribution system of how water is delivered and figure out a way when buildings are sprinklered that we can draw down the number of hydrants that are within a certain area. Now, this doesn't seem like a big deal on large scale. You know, when you look at it from a macro perspective, it may not seem like it ends up being that much. But I would tell you, in looking across the city, we do have quite a few private hydrants. And the private hydrant business is a tough issue to try to take on just from a cost perspective. What you see in front of you is a overhead view of west side of Sioux Falls, just off the corner of 18th Street and West Dardanella. One of the interesting stories that I shared with the task force was a conversation I had with a developer who was developing the property here just north of Willow Meadows Place. Ironically enough, the developer came to me and wanted to know where he needed to put another fire hydrant. He had figured that he needed to put another fire hydrant in because the multi-story apartment that he was going to be building would not have the required water flows. He did also mention to me that he planned on sprinklering that apartment building. And as a result, that developer has not put in any fire hydrant around that apartment building whatsoever. If you notice, there's a hydrant just to the west. And as we measured that fire hydrant to all the corners of where the apartment was going to be positioned, it was within 500 feet of all portions of that building. And therefore, that one fire hydrant could cover the entire apartment complex. Now, you'll notice just to the south in the corner there's another purple private fire hydrant. That was required as a result of the distance from this street side hydrant that's just to the south. Now, in explaining this to the developers, what I tried to put this in context was, generally, if we sprinkler a building, that means we get rid of at least one fire hydrant, and it gets our private developers out of the hydrant business. I brought up this example because it shows just to the east a mobile home park that you'll notice has a bunch of purple hydrants in it, all of them private, and all of them required to be tested on an annual basis, just like every other hydrant in the city is required. But these systems are problematic, and I would tell you, I don't want to speak for the fire chief, but long-term for the city of Sioux Falls, I don't believe, my professional opinion is, it's not in our interest to put folks in the business of private hydrants. It ends up being higher costs to try to deal with these systems. Often they're not maintained. And for us as a city, long-term, it may not be the best strategy for us to look at more private hydrants. I think it's a better strategy for us long-term to look at diminishing that number and managing those hydrant systems through the water department. In most cases, in almost every development that I looked at across the city where fire sprinklers could have been applied, we could have gotten rid of private fire hydrants and used public fire hydrants that are street side because they all fell within that 500-foot distance criteria.
Any questions from the committee? Councilor Aguilar?
So do we test the private ones also?
Yes, ma'am. We ask for permission. The water department goes out, asks the owner for permission to go and test those hydrants. We do get permission back. I didn't bring the binder full of test materials that we did for the last few years, but it is quite a huge undertaking. As you drive around the city, you notice that there are hydrants in a lot of mobile home parks. Most of those are private hydrant systems. and most of those are problematic for us.
I had no idea we had private hydrants. I thought they were all the cities.
No, ma'am.
And that's
Thank you.
why I asked him to bring this up. It was surprising to me also, and to know that, you know, we do get to annually check them, but we have to ask. It's not something that is just an automatic. And if the property owner says no, then we don't get to check them. They may also have different, if I'm right, different size water lines going into them. There might not be a sufficient amount of water coming out of that hydrant for the fire to actually utilize it. Please.
How many would you estimate we have that are private? Do you have any idea? So would you suggest that we take them over, or we just no longer?
I think what I've suggested to Chief Sedaris is developing a strategy where we slowly but surely constrain these private hydrant systems until they're just out of existence, that we slowly but surely get rid of them. We can do that through attrition and through not adding more private fire hydrants to what's already a bit of a stress system.
Any other questions from the committee? Mr. Karski?
Not specifically regarding fire hydrants, but maybe the whole ordinance here. We've heard from, you know, our city employees. Is there anybody representing home builders or multifamily here that would like to speak?
Everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Chief, or excuse me, Dean, if you could also speak to the trade-offs that the task force and the committee came up with.
Yep. What's been defined in fire code right now has been in existence for since the 2000 fire code revision and the building code as well. It provides, what it's trying to do is provide incentives for builders to use fire sprinklers inside buildings. It goes through things like fire resistivities, the big things that we found from our task force are the biggest costs are street pavements and fire hydrants. Those are large costs. And while I will admit they don't offset the entire bill of sprinklering an apartment building, they average about a quarter to a third of the cost estimate for sprinklering these buildings. So it isn't a perfect one-for-one exchange. You're not getting all of the money in offsets. All of those trade-offs are already defined within fire code, and we could have used them 10 years ago if somebody would have come to us saying they would like to sprinkler a building. So these are elements that are already within fire code. We can exercise them at any point that a building is sprinklered. We've been working with the development community and those folks that have come forward with projects that are in progress now, working through sprinklering those buildings. I think what they would, as they go through the process, what they'll start to understand is the scope of the system that we're talking about is not a similar system as what you will find in a multi-story building or inside a Walmart. We're really kind of comparing apples and oranges if we try to compare a 16 or below apartment building to a multi-story or commercial project that has a more robust system.
Thank you. A couple issues that I found on this also was the communication between the state and the city. Whether it stopped at the municipal league or if it was a state issue, one of the problems I found is that the state updates their building and fire codes through administrative rule. So there's a lot less public input, I feel, in that process. And I have spoken to several members of the legislature asking them to take a look into that. But I also feel that the council representative to the municipal league should also, hopefully would also bring up this issue. I think that the communication issue now has been repaired, but I still have concerns on the administrative rule. And then the city also, within the next, I believe, 2 years, will be getting the new international building codes and fire codes. So at least this will give us more equal footing with the rest of the state. What I would like to do at this time is I'll go again here as Councilman Karski asked, is there any public input to this? Okay. I do want to thank the committee members, task force members who showed up today to give their support or maybe even be called out to ask their opinions on this, and I won't do that. And also our home builders representative who has sat through all the task force members' meetings also to make sure that their inputs were heard. We had members of the Multi-Housing Association on the task force, large and small. We had engineers that actually do sprinkler systems. A lot of the discussion was very dry and very technical. But I think that we did some really good work, and hopefully if the council and this committee here accepts their findings, that Sioux Falls can be a safer place. So with that, I would look for a motion to move this to the city council agenda.
So moved, Aguilar.
Second, Karski.
Okay, there's first and second. With that, I'd ask Councilor Aguilar, or Councilor Erfenbach.
I wonder if we want to, I keep thinking about what Councilor Karski was saying. Do we want to add that amendment to to make sure that the groups are, the electrical board and the plumbing board have 5 members?
I have been assured that that will be
Okay.
on the next
So
presentation.
it'll come.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, good, thank you.
Okay. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Okay, that passes 4-0. We now have an open discussion time period. Councilor Aguilar.
I was wondering, now that we've gotten this to the council, what's happening with taxi cabs?
That is coming right around the corner. Our next meeting, we will have updates on the taxi cab ordinance. I know that the city attorney's office has been working on that with the police department and a couple of our council clerks, and coming up with some new legislation for that. So I would expect we'd see that in next month's PCS meeting.
Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Anything else today?
You know, if I could just comment that I think we have the hardest working chair of a committee on the city council. Councilor Anderson, you really go the extra mile. Thank you for the work you do.
Thank you. With that, then, I will adjourn this meeting.